the Associate Director of the Writing Hub. I also am an alumni of UCSD. I got my PhD in sociology in 2018. And so some of what I'm going to communicate to you today is, or convey to you today, is something that I think is good writing practice that I would sort of stand behind as like a representative of the Writing Center on campus. But also I want to say that a lot of it was information that I actually used and put into practice in my own writing as much as I could. Sadly, I learned this way too late in grad school, and I wish I would have learned it sooner. But so the principles that I'm going to offer you today are going to be broad enough that they could work for folks in engineering as well as the sociologists like me, and also like broadly from a writing center perspective. And so I want to say like that as a sort of caveat of like, we're going to be talking about generalities here, and we won't necessarily be able to dig into the specifics of your particular research and how to make that a science story. So I just want to make sure that's clear going forward. And I want to start off actually with asking you a couple of questions. And so it's Zoom. Zoom is weird. You might be multitasking. Who am I to tell you how to live your life or how to engage with this workshop? But if you can either come on mic to share this or just put it in the chat. And there's going to be an uncomfortable amount of lag time because I realize folks need time to put things in the chat. And so it's going to be like some strange amount of silence, but just roll with me. And so I'm going to put a few questions up, and I would appreciate if you could just like roll with me and share some of your thoughts here. So I don't know if any of y'all are Reddit users, but there's a subreddit called Explain Like I'm 5. And this is their little abbreviation. So I would like you in the chat or on mic to explain to me, Erica, like I'm 5, what is the goal of your current research? What are you working on? But not just what are you working on, but what's the goal? What are you trying to do or achieve with your current research? And if you could explain that like I'm 5, that will help me a lot. So again, uncomfortable silence, put it in the chat. What's the goal of your research? Not what is your research, what's its goal? Again, I want to say you're explaining like I'm 5. So that also means like maybe 1 or 2 sentences. What's the goal of your current research? Excellent. So medicines that help cure malaria. Thank you, Carla. And Christian, understand how cells in your body process nutrients and waste. This is perfect. This is a perfect Explain Like I'm 5 explanation. So I'm going to give a couple more minutes for folks to share if they want. What are you trying to do in your research? I also want to add that this actually, even though Explain Like I'm 5 seems like it actually should be really quite simple, it's actually very, very difficult. It's extremely difficult for people who are experts and near experts in an area to reduce all of that complexity and the nuances and the scientific and technical details of their work down to this sort of like core essence of like, ultimately at the end of the day, this is what I'm trying to do. If nothing else, it's this. And so I think, yeah, so things are coming in, new energy efficient sensing techniques, a robust way to command devices to get the desired response from those devices, robots for surgery. Okay, this is awesome. Advancements in biomagnetics for treatment in neuromodulation. Matthew, I'm going to challenge you to ask yourself if a 5-year-old could understand what neuromodulation is, because I don't. I'm not 5, but I don't know what neuromodulation is. Parts of the body and medical images to improve the identification of disease. Yeah, awesome. So notice what's happening here. What's happening is you're thinking about language and you're thinking about the stakes of what you're trying to do. And you're holding both of these things at the same time. You're thinking about, okay, like what is like language that is really simple, but still is honest and still captures what I'm trying to do. And then you're also thinking about the sort of stakes of your research. So I am like 100% sure that the folks who are studying malaria, that the work is much more complicated, right? But malaria and thinking about curing malaria, that's the stakes. That's what's at stake here in this research. So that's what's happening. Thank you. I still don't exactly know what biomagnetics is, but that's fine. Severe depression and PTSD through biomagnetics. Awesome. I assume those are like magnets that go in your brain, but I don't know if that's true. So again, I want you to hold on to that fact that you're holding on, and what you're thinking about here when you're asked to produce a statement like this is you think in 2 dimensions. One is about the essence of your research and what are you doing, and 2 is about the language that you can use to convey that essence really simply and clearly. And so, okay, you don't have to answer these next questions in the chat, but I want you just to think about it. And I want you to think about, okay, you're doing all of this fantastic research. How will your research go from your brain and or your lab, your research group, to where? Where does the information need to go? Where does the information need to travel to? Because right now, what you're doing lives with you, lives with your research group, lives with your PI, and lives like maybe in the material resources of your research environment, but that's not where the research is going to achieve its goal, is it? How does the research achieve its goal to cure malaria or treat PTSD or severe depression? Like, where does the information need to travel to? So I just want you to hold on to think about that for yourself. How does your research need to go from where it is now to where it needs to go? Where is that, and how will the information need to travel? If you're thinking like, I'm going to publish it, duh, Erica, it's like, yes, I know. And that's the whole point of this question, is to remind you that your research, complex, interesting, important as it is, has to be communicated to people. Otherwise, it's not research, or maybe that's not the right word. It's not knowledge, is it? Research is the act that we do in order to generate knowledge, and knowledge is actually what solves what creates the solution that defines the goal of your research. The research provides the knowledge that helps us understand the dynamics of these medicines for malaria, that helps us understand the role of biomagnetics in PTSD and severe depression. It's knowledge, and knowledge is merely, and again, roll with me here, knowledge is merely information communicated through language. That is how knowledge travels. It travels through language, and it travels through a combination of both written and spoken language to other people. And so how we often experience this language, this sort of knowledge as being transferred or sort of transported through the vehicle of language, is often through scientific articles that we're reading. And I want you to think about a scientific article that you've read recently, sometime in your life maybe, that was impactful. And you remember that, like, oh yeah, I think I like that article. Or I remember what that article was about, even though I haven't looked at it in several months. I remember what it says and what it's doing. And start unpacking, like, what makes that scientific article memorable for you, even maybe months or potentially even years later, I remember reading something, and it still is something I think about to this day. I'm a sociologist, and the article is about fried chicken. I don't really care about fried chicken, and I'm not a sociologist of food, but they made a really compelling argument about the nature of fried chicken as a kind of contested cultural artifact. And that's like still to this day is like a fascinating piece of information and knowledge that I read. And so we know then that we have goals of our research, that our research is conducted, that it needs to be packaged into language and then transported to other people. It needs to be transported to other scientists, to policymakers, to doctors, to people in the industry. Like, we need to transport that information through the vehicle of language to an audience that needs to acquire that information and let that information inform them. And so often that is in the form of these scientific articles. But then we also have experience as readers of scientific articles, right? And we might think like, well, what makes writing science challenging? What makes it challenging to actually do all of this? My impression and my instinct is that what you're doing is actually much more complex than this explain like I'm five piece actually can allow for. It's highly technical. There are lots of details that need to be brought into the conversation, and the contributions and the forays you make into this field might feel actually pretty small because it's just one piece of this larger puzzle, and the whole puzzle is the explain like I'm five goal, but your contribution is just this one piece. And so it's hard to like not recreate every single piece of the puzzle as you're trying to present this bigger picture. So what I'm going to hope to offer you today is some ideas for getting through this, ideas for getting your information packaged into language in a way that a reader will actually be able to see and perceive and to use, and will actually hopefully aid your writing process for generating from that research language that holds the information that it needs to hold. So how do we do this? How do we actually do this well? And I think the title of the workshop gives it away: embrace telling stories. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying you're writing fictional stories. That is not at all what I'm saying. That a research story is not something that is made up or fabricated or contrived. It's nothing like that. Really, what all of a research story is a kind of narrative, where the narrative is grounded in data and existing scholarship, but it creates through a narrative structure the look and feel of a story. And that's for the reader to help them understand what's at stake here. So I like this quote a lot, and I would actually recommend this book to everyone. I recommend it enthusiastically to everyone I meet, not just scientists. It's a book by Joshua Schimmel, Writing Science: How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funded. A lot of this workshop is actually coming straight from Joshua Schimmel's book. But I like this quote from Schimmel, and he says, "A paper doesn't just present the data, it also interprets them. A paper tells a story about nature and how it works." He's a biologist, by the way. It builds a story from the data, but the data are not the story. The papers that get cited the most and the proposals that get funded are those that tell the most compelling stories. And I really want to pull out this idea that the data, the story is told from the data aren't the stories. I want to also push you to think that the technical details and the technical elements of your work are the pieces that are part of the story. They are not the story. The story is something else, and that's what I want to talk about today. So why would I start by telling a bunch of folks that you need to start writing stories? Well, because like actually there's like research behind the fact that they will make you more successful as a writer, as a scholar, like as a thinker, that stories actually are a profound cognitive vehicle. They're a really, really important cognitive tool for humans. And so humans, if you think about how humans have evolved from the time of our ape ancestors, right? One of the things that distinguishes us from other species on the planet is our ability to have language. And through language, we have been able to pass down information intergenerationally. So that way each new sort of generation of human isn't like starting from scratch. We're building on the shoulders of all of humanity that's come before us, because humanity has been able to teach intergenerationally through language, right? But for most of human life, writing was not how we conveyed language. Language was spoken. There maybe were other kinds of like proto writing, like images and stuff like that. But spoken language was how knowledge transfer occurred across generations for most of time. And so how does that happen? How did we experience a lot of intergenerational knowledge? It was through stories and parables. And so we have evolved, quite literally, our brains have evolved to grasp stories more quickly, to remember stories and to recall them more quickly and also with more accuracy, and to also feel a kind of emotional connection to the information when it's presented in a story structure. And that emotional connection is a profound instrument for our memory. And so stories are immensely powerful linguistic tools that we should all be using more often, because our brains are evolved to grasp them and to remember them more easily than other kinds of information. But more pragmatically, like if I'm not swaying you on the evolutionary argument, that's fine. I don't care. I'm a sociologist. I'm not an evolutionary biologist or a cognitive scientist. But more pragmatically, if we accept that stories are just easier to read, that they're just easier to understand, who knows why, but we can accept that stories entertain us, they capture our attention, then your reader, if you're writing a research story, has more context to care. They have context to keep reading and to keep exploring and to kind of go on the science journey with you that you're arguing for in this article that you're writing. And so I mentioned earlier that article about fried chicken. I care not at all about fried chicken, but I do really care about the contestation of culture. I really care about how culture is like cemented and understood, and how different groups of people get to fight over culture. I care about that. And so because I care about that, and that was the broader story that those authors were writing about, it motivated me. It gave me the context to keep reading about fried chicken, even though fried chicken is not a thing I think about ever, really. It also more pragmatically gives your reader context for grasping the details, whether it's the techniques of the method that you're using, the dynamic of the analysis, or how the data behave, what we can see in existing literature, and whose literature we need to understand in order to position ourselves against or within it. All of those details become players in a story. And the significance of all of that information is apparent, not because we spend exhaustive amounts of time explaining why those details are significant, but because we have set those details into a structure. So telling a story is actually not as much about writing it out at the level of sentences, as much as it's about organizing information in a particular order that the reader can perceive that there is a narrative happening. They can perceive that there is a narrative being shaped. And so again, it's not about over explaining your all of these technical details and explaining them to death, like as if your reader was 5. It's about explaining, it's about introducing the information that you need, but in an order that the reader can understand and walk along with you to see why it's important. So that's actually what I want to focus on today. It's not how to tell a story at the level of like words and phrases, but at the level of a narrative structure. So very basic, a narrative structure has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's as detailed as we're getting today. The beginning of every narrative sets up a context or world. It's like the opening of the story and provides context. So I'm sort of going to rely here first on fictional stories. I did tell you are not writing fiction. I stand by that. But for the sake of understanding narrative structure, we're going to just sort of temporarily detour into like, let's think about fictional stories that we've interacted with, right? The beginning sets up the setting of the story. We have a sense of who the characters are going to be, what kind of world they inhabit, and what's going on. Then in the middle, we start to see that there's a central problem. There's a central challenge for this story, and characters have to engage in actions in order to address or deal with that challenge. So like Lord of the Rings, right? They got to take the ring to, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm failing you. I'm not remembering the place where they have to take the ring. Anyways, I'm sorry that I'm deeply embarrassed by this. And so often in the middle of this story, there's this kind of change. Alicia, are you going to tell me where they take the ring?
Yeah, I think it's Mordor.
Thank you, Mordor. Yes. Oh, that was gonna like haunt. It still is gonna haunt me all day. So anyway, so the characters, they have to do things, right? They have to go and address this action, and then the resolution. Sometimes it's told over the course of a single story. Sometimes over the course of a trilogy of information. That the challenge gets resolved, or at least gets partially resolved enough for now, right? The reader can walk away, or the viewer can walk away. And so here's a sort of visual diagram of what I've just said of this beginning, middle, and end structure. And I'm just going to kind of walk through an example of the Hunger Games, because I think lots of folks have seen that, and it just provides a really nice example. So at the beginning of the Hunger Games, right, we have this sense of like, there's this world, there's 12 districts, there's a capital, life sucks for everybody who's not in the capital, and there's this thing called the Hunger Games, and the Hunger Games are kind of punishment for a revolt, right? And then we have this sort of clear and present challenge of in this moment when the main character, Katniss Everdeen, when her sister is selected to go in the Hunger Games, and then what does Katniss do? She brushes up, I volunteer as tribute. And that's answering the challenge, right? She's like, there's a challenge for us, the audience, of like the Hunger Games is a thing, and it sucks, and people die, and someone has to die, and it can't be Katniss's sister. So Katniss is risking herself, and that's the challenge of like, we want this character to live. And so the middle of the entire Hunger Games is the actions that Katniss and the other characters have to take on, the understandings that get generated from the actions that they take, whether it's getting sponsors, or like interacting with the arena, or learning the weaknesses of opponents, or whatever. Learning the weaknesses of the system itself, right? There's actions that are taken and understandings that are generated from those actions. And then this is at the end of the first book / film. There's a sort of resolved enough challenge. Our character doesn't die, but also she defied the structure, she defied the system, and then that creates context for a new world in the next book, right? Or in the next film. Okay, so that's with this story, or that's with a fictional story. And I want to say, actually, we can adopt this framework of narrative structure and already start seeing how most scientific articles are already sort of in a structure like this. We just need to change the words for ourselves. So we're used to this kind of IMRAD structure of intro, methods, results, and discussion. That's what IMRAD stands for. But if we keep the same structure, but just change the words around, what we're actually then doing is seeing not what each section is called, but rather we're starting to think, what does each section do for the reader? What does each section do for a reader who is experiencing this information? And for that, Schimmel calls this OCAR, opening, challenge, action, resolution. So it's the same structure, right? So in the intro and lit review, you're setting up context and signaling a clear challenge for your reader. In the middle of the narrative, you're signaling the actions that you do. So opening, challenge, action, and actions are the methodology you employ, the techniques you had to master, the results of your work, or of your modeling, or of whatever experiment or anything that you might have done, and also the understandings that generated from that. So sometimes we would call this like a finding or a result, right? A result isn't just the data. The result is the data and how the data gets interpreted, how the data gets understood, and generates an understanding. So that's the middle. And then of course, the conclusion resolves the central challenge. So this is altogether not exactly different from what we're used to. I'm not advocating that you write a different kind of article and you throw these sections to the C, and like I'm actually arguing that you can keep the same information or the same sections that you're used to, but start thinking about how your reader experiences these sections as a potential avenue for seeing this as a story and as a narrative. So let's think about your science story in particular, right? So you can think about the opening and challenge is where you bring in broad amounts of information and you gradually narrow that information towards a particular knowledge problem. And I'm going to use knowledge problem and challenge. Oops, excuse me. I'm going to use knowledge problem and challenge interchangeably here. So knowledge problem is really just you are signaling that there's something about our state of knowledge that is incomplete or insufficient or maybe even bad and wrong. But you are arguing that there is a knowledge problem. But you can't just go straight to the knowledge problem. You have to provide a sufficient opening. You have to build towards your knowledge problem by providing us an opening and a context for what's going on, and then helping us see and arrive to the knowledge problem. From there, your methods section helps you sort of explain how you address that challenge, how you take on that challenge, take and face that knowledge problem, and what we can do to change or alleviate the knowledge problem. And then your sub-analyses in your results and discussion or your results and findings sections. Again, these are like contained but small sub-analyses that together reveal some aspect, or they help us understand some piece of this problem. And then what's resolved and what isn't is part of what's in the conclusion of your research story. So this is the same information, but actually just broken out by section, right? So we have this intro and background, grounding literature, it narrows towards the problem and how the current research is going to address the problem. The methods section is this kind of like call to arms, like here's how we're doing this. The results and discussion section make in their own way with each particular finding, if you have multiple findings or if you have one finding that's broken up into different pieces. Each piece needs to be brought into the context of the challenge again, and then the conclusion kind of synthesizes that all together, explains the contribution, and suggests applications or extensions. And again, all of that should be in service to the original challenge, the original knowledge problem that you set up in the introduction and or background section. So I actually think that this piece, even though I've just sort of laid out this whole narrative structure for you, and this is all very much important for telling a research story, telling a science story, I actually think it's this top piece that is the most tricky. It's the most challenging. It's the most important. And here's why. It's during this moment, the opening and challenge, where your reader has the maximum amount of attention and openness. And I know you might be thinking like, I never read the introduction, Erica. I go straight to the figures. I go straight to the like figures, the tables, the formula, whatever. And that is true. I get that, but I want you to recognize that your tendency to go straight to the figures and the advice that you get to like ignore all of this intro and lit review stuff, that's evidence of an expert level reading process. And most of the people who read your articles are not going to be sufficiently experts in your field to just read your data and know exactly what they mean and know exactly how you're using them. And it's actually really frustrating when you get reviewers who it's clear that that's all they did, that they just jumped straight to the results, or they just jumped straight to the data, and they didn't take the time to actually read how you're using the data. And so their suggestions and their critiques are kind of incomplete, because if they would have just read in that next paragraph, they would see that you're doing the thing that they say you should do with it. And so your tendency to go straight to figures, captions, to formula, etc., it might only reflect an expert level reading process. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to these other pieces, because the vast majority of people who find your work in an academic database or wherever are going to read. They are going to need this information in order to make sense of what they're about to encounter with the data and encounter in the findings section. So this is where your reader has maximum attention and openness. This is where you set expectations for the rest of the paper. Imagine that in your intro section, you're kind of like making a kind of implicit promise to the reader And the rest of the paper has to fulfill that promise. And so it's really important to pay attention to this section. But it also is important. The reason why I think this is the trickiest and most important section is this is where you're actually building the knowledge problem that motivates and unites the rest of the story. Everything else that happens in the paper, whether it's the method you employ, the analytical framework that you use, the data that you generate and present, or the interpretation of that data that you input into the wherever it goes in the prose or in the table, all of that has to be in service to the knowledge problem that you say exists. Because otherwise, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this research if not to solve this larger knowledge problem? And so the knowledge problem is, you imagine like a linchpin, or it's like, this is like a really important turning point. Like creating that knowledge problem is the jumping off point for everything else in the paper. So the attention that you pay to carefully constructing that knowledge problem sets you up to have a lot easier of a time and a lot more of success with the rest of the paper, because you know exactly what to tie every other element in the paper to, including all of those little technical details that is hard to get them all into the right structure and the right order. And so there's a term for this about how to sort of narrow in the introduction section towards a knowledge problem. And it's called creating a research space. And it's by these folks, Swales and Peak. And so I'm going to walk through very briefly what creating a research space entails. So let me just sort of define it first, and I'm going to break this down, so don't worry. So creating a research space essentially means rhetorical moves. So by rhetorical, well, I just said I was going to define it. So let me just read it. Rhetorical moves that bring the reader from a broad research territory toward a research niche, then toward a research project or research agenda that addresses a knowledge problem within that niche. So again, breaking this down. What is a rhetorical move? A rhetorical move is just a choice that the writer makes in terms of how to introduce knowledge or frame knowledge in a particular way. So a rhetorical move could be the information that you put first, or the information that you don't put first. You put something else first, and that signals a kind of logical order and a logical relationship between concepts, because you're introducing one as first and another one second. You're sort of arguing implicitly for a logical relationship between those concepts. But often rhetorical moves are also signaled through certain kinds of language, certain kinds of words and sentences. So adjectives, for example, and adverbs, any kind of modifier that you would put in front of a citation or in front of a technique. So if you say like, this technique is especially useful, that's a kind of rhetorical move. You're signaling something to your reader about how they should think about that technique and what you're likely to do with talking about that technique. You're going to go from talking about this is exceptionally useful, and then probably what your reader interprets as coming next is like, they're going to talk about why it's useful, or we're going to just sort of talk more about this technique because they've argued that it's useful. So these kinds of words and phrases are helpful for stance taking, and that's a rhetorical move. Another kind of rhetorical move is like transitional phrases. So things like, however, in addition, or by contrast. Those kinds of phrases help signal relationships between ideas, and those are all rhetorical moves. So that's all a rhetorical move is. It's how you order information and the kind of language you include to help your reader understand how they should think about the information that you're offering them. Okay, so rhetorical moves, so meaning language and ordering of information that move the reader from a broad research territory toward a research niche. A research territory is a very broad terrain or subfield of research. And so this is usually done by establishing the topic as part of a particular research area. So your topics might fall under the area of disease or treatment for disease. They might fall under robotics. They might fall under distance medicine or something like that. That's a sort of broad research territory. And you go from that territory and narrow it down toward a research niche, which is a space within that territory that is being further explored, where we have more questions, there's more to understand here. And it's actually in the niche, not in the territory, that you start to build a knowledge problem. The territory is too vast. It's kind of like if we were going on a road trip and I was going to say like, oh, we need to stop for gas. We wouldn't say like, we need to stop for gas in the state of Louisiana, because there's a gazillion and a half places to stop for gas in Louisiana. I assume I've never been to Louisiana. But if we're going to start thinking about, oh, where are we going to stop for gas? Where are we going to get food? And where are we going to spend the night? Where are we going to like find a hotel to sleep in because we can't drive all day? We couldn't do that in the entire state of Louisiana, right? We would need to like figure out where in the state we're going to be. And that's where we start to solve those problems. It's the same sort of idea for your research. You build a knowledge problem within a niche in a broader research territory. So you start to signal a place in the territory that can be further understood, better understood, further questioned. There's more exploration to do here. And then in that space is you start to articulate if there's a gap in the knowledge that we know, if we can argue against known knowledge or problematize, sorry if you can hear my dogs, problematize that knowledge, if we can raise questions or if we can extend that knowledge. That's how you start building a knowledge problem in the niche. And then once you have started to establish a knowledge problem, you occupy the niche by suggesting a particular research project or a particular way of doing research that could address those knowledge problems, fill that gap, achieve the counterclaim, answer the questions, etc. So this is where you suggest how your work will address that knowledge problem and how the research will provide material to do that, and how your particular project right now is connected to this knowledge problem you've created. So this is the CARS model, creating a research space. You establish a territory, narrow that territory into a niche, build a knowledge problem within that niche, and then signal what could address that knowledge problem, aka occupy the niche. So this is sort of visual representation of the same information. And then to bring Schimmel back into this, and Schimmel, of course, is the person who came up with OCAR, Opening Challenge Action Resolution, how we would bring these two things together. This is how you establish or create a research space. The first part of the creating a research space is the opening. So this is the setting of your work. This is the setting of your research. This is providing a sort of broad sense of like, here's our world and here's what's going on in this world. And once you start building a knowledge problem, once you start making claims about there's questions we can ask, there's applications to be explored, there's more things we can do, that's where you're starting to build the challenge. So there are questions we can ask. How do we answer those questions? There's applications that can be made. Which applications and where would we start to learn how to apply these things? So those are challenges that you are building in. So this is the opening of the OCAR and the challenge of the OCAR model. And again, I want to emphasize that the challenge that you build and the knowledge problem you create in the opening of your article actually sets you up very nicely to achieve a narrative structure for the rest of the paper, because that challenge, that knowledge problem motivates and unites every other section. And I mentioned earlier that part of what makes narratives great is that they give your reader context to care, and they give your reader context for details. And so by giving your reader a clear sense of a knowledge problem, these are the stakes of this is what's at stake in this research, that provides them context to care to keep reading about your methods, to keep reading through to your findings, to help understand what you found and understand, therefore, the knowledge problem that you convince them exists. So that's context to care. But then all of the details that are relevant to these particular sections also have a framework for why those details matter. So you might have a lot of methodological details, a lot of technical detail about how the research worked, how the research was achieved, how it was done. But if you set up the whole methodological paradigm under this particular knowledge problem, like here's what we're trying to achieve, then you can tie in those details to the broader methodological approach. And you can make the case that that's the methodological approach that is necessary for this particular knowledge problem. For this particular challenge, we need these particular methods, and these are the details that are related to that particular method. And so the structure also provides context for all of the little technical pieces and the specifics. It helps unite them together because we know what we're doing. And the device of a challenge, the device of the knowledge problem, is a really powerful one. It has a lot of capacity to hold a lot of interesting information. All right, so today my whole point, and we have time for questions at the end, but the whole thing of what I was trying to argue for you today is that you can organize your work into a narrative structure, and that telling stories are beneficial. They're beneficial for you as a writer. They're also beneficial for your reader because it helps them understand what you're doing. And that's the point of science, right? The whole point of science is to understand things in the world and to help people achieve better things in the world through those understandings. But science doesn't do that. Or let me rephrase that. Research alone, the techniques and specifics of generating data alone, is not what science is. That's not how science accomplished its mission. Science, if you think about it, is really that same kind of intergenerational knowledge transfer that has always and will always happen through language of some kind of linguistic display of information, at least until we have some other like post-language way of communicating, which I don't know, I'm not a linguist, so I can't get into that. But science and communicating science is part of that whole evolutionary chain. Language is important for that. Language is the vehicle for that. And stories and narratives are probably one of our most powerful ways for organizing complex information as humans. We have inherited the ability to perceive stories from long in our evolutionary history. So I also argued that the narrative structure and setting up an opening, challenge, action, and resolution is really all you need to do to have a compelling story. You don't need to have a lot of drippy prose or a lot of like lengthy sentences with these vast descriptions, and you don't need to like, what is it that they say, like use all your senses? Like that is not the kind of story y'all are writing. You're writing a narrative, which means you just need to mostly pay attention to the structure. But I have a couple of other additional tips that are not related to the structure as I've just described it. And these are really general, but the first tip is to not take your reader for granted. The best writing doesn't assume the reader's attention, it motivates the reader's attention. I think a narrative structure is a huge part of what motivates a reader to keep reading. But a lot of us, especially graduate students, and remember, I was a graduate student myself, so I know this from my own lived experience. I think we assume that the reader is just going to read it. We just assume that. And maybe that's because we write often for our PIs or for our advisors, and we have a different relationship with our advisor. Like, I would expect my advisor to read things because she's my advisor. That's like part of her job. And part of my job is to write things that she tells me I need to write. And so, but your reader, a sort of general reader, after your work gets published, they don't owe you their attention. That's not their job to read the whole thing. And so as a writer, you have the responsibility to not assume their attention, but to earn it. And you earn it, I think, by helping them understand the context and the stakes. And here's what we're trying to understand and why. Here's why the method is necessary for that. Here's what I found. And here's how the things that I found helps us understand this critical knowledge problem. And then going forward, here's what we're going to do. That narrative structure helps keep your reader's attention and helps sustain and motivate your reader's attention. It's also important to remember that very few readers will actually have your expertise. This might be true for like a small subsection of the humans who can and will read your work. And on some level, there's differences of opinion over whether you should write for those small subsample of humans, or if you should write for the entire audience of the journal that you're applying to, or the sort of broader publication that you're trying to get access to. I fall into the camp of like, knowledge is for people, for people to use, not for like only tiny slices of people to use. And so just remember that very few readers will have your expertise. And so you should calibrate your language and the whether or not you explain particular terms accordingly. There's no hard and fast rule for this, because how much you explain your terms, how simple your language is, that's a political conversation. And that's a conversation about policing the boundaries around disciplines and gatekeeping and knowledge and academia. And like, I'm not going to get into that in an hour-long workshop, but just remember that the fact of the world is that only 2% of the world's population gets PhDs, and even less than that get PhDs in your discipline, and even less than that get PhDs in your discipline in your research area. And so just notice that how you use information, how you write information, the language is going to be constructing an audience for itself, and to just calibrate your language choices accordingly. How you organize information matters. I talked about the whole sort of structure of the entire piece and the introduction today, but it also matters how you organize information in each sentence and in each paragraph. And generally, I'll say the end of each sentence needs to have a connection to the beginning of the next sentence, or the end of each paragraph needs to be connected to the beginning of the next paragraph. And again, by helping your reader see the logical connection from one sentence to the next, from one paragraph to the next, that helps sustain their attention. It helps sustain their motivation to keep reading, and that's what helps you earn their attention rather than assuming it. And again, I realize I might be like stepping onto a minefield here, because this is like a very hotly contested and hotly felt issue in the disciplines. But I do think that you can safely use scholarly pronouns, I, we, and or our team, our research group, whatever. And how you should ask yourself, is it appropriate to use a scholarly pronoun or not, is, did you as the researcher do something to make it happen? Or did the thing just happen? Did it just occur? If it did just occur, like you set a model in motion, or you like set something going in the method, and then the thing just operated on its own, fine, no need for the scholarly eye. But if you did something, a scholarly eye is completely appropriate. And in fact, there's been many studies of research writing across multiple disciplines, and mostly in STEM disciplines, because that's where a lot of the feeling gets expressed. And while there is less use of scholarly pronouns in STEM writing, there is still plenty of scholarly pronoun use being committed in STEM writing. So it's a little bit of folklore that you can't use the word I at all. It's just there's ways to deploy the scholarly I or the scholarly we that has to do with your actions as a researcher versus other kinds of actions. So there's that. All right, so I'm from the Writing Hub, as I said, and this is just a sort of preview of our thinking. And so hopefully if you've engaged with the Writing Hub before, you found this a kind of refreshing reminder of like, yes, the Writing Hub, I know the Writing Hub. But if you haven't heard of the Writing Hub or interacted with us, we have a lot more resources than just this. This is just one of a couple dozen workshops that we offer in departments, but we also have workshops that we offer in the Writing Hub, as well as consultations with consultants. We have a writing room if you're working on a scientific article now and you're needing time and space to get that done. We have a writing room that meets every single weekday morning. And when we're in person, it'll have coffee, but right now it's just on Zoom, and that's a time and space for you to write with other people. We have writing retreats if you want to do a writing retreat. And if you're working on your dissertation, we have a dissertation writers workshop that's on pause for the spring, but will happen again in the summer. And that's all for me. We have a few minutes left, so I'm happy to entertain questions or thoughts or curiosities, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you, Sinai. Thank you, Esther. Yeah, Carla, this is a really good question. Oh gosh, where to begin? I think probably the most help, I mean, there's the answer to Carla, to your question is like, yes, a gazillion, like whole books, whole programs of academic scholarship are done on that exact question. And so in the space of 7 minutes, I would say my answer actually it centers on reading. And I think actually this is true for most people, is that reading as analytically, not just reading for the content of an article and understanding what the article is about, but reading for language and reading to see how sentences are structured, how information is ordered. Reverse outlining someone else's work is a really powerful tool for doing that, as well as, reverse outlining and I totally blanked. Oh, and I don't want to say like sentence diagramming necessarily, but just trying to like dissect and analyze a particular sentence. So if there's a paragraph that feels really well written, it's like, oh, I'm following along on this. Start to dissect paragraph by paragraph by like listing out each sentence and breaking apart, like, what is it that's making this sentence clear? Oftentimes it's because the subject is really apparent. The verb and the subject are like pretty close together. They're not separated by like miles of words. And usually it's also because the end of that sentence connects to the beginning of the sentence that follows after it. And so my general advice is read analytically, read for linguistic form. And because I don't actually like the phrase non-native speakers. For people who are multilingual and who have fluency in multiple languages, you have incredible linguistic assets that monolingual people like myself just don't have. And so you have the capacity to dissect and analyze language in that manner because you have that experience and that expertise. And so you can leverage that and start analyzing things in written form, either at the sort of broad level, at the paragraph level in terms of reverse outlining, or at the sentence level by actually starting to dissect like what makes this sentence clear linguistically. That was like a really rough, like off the cuff answer.
Hi, Erica. I have a question for you. In the first slide, when you were telling us, explain your research like I'm 5, I think that exercise is relatively easy for me. I mean, when you casually talk about your research, oh, it's about this and that. But now what I struggle the most is with translating it to not the 5 people.
Yeah, of course.
So I don't know how to put it in a more formal journal style, or, you know, the way it should be at the end.
Yeah, so this is true for everyone. I think what you signaled with the like I'm 5, that's the tippy top of the research territory. And so remember, we had that like research territory that narrows into a niche, research niche. You start to like build some problems in that niche, and then you go and fill that problem in that niche with your particular research project. And so the thing that you put at the like I'm 5 is like PTSD and or maybe not even and biomagnetics. It's just like PTSD and depression. And then we start to like build these like layers of more specificity. So then if Alicia, remind me of what your explain like I'm 5 was. Oh,
I'm trying to find it myself.
Yeah. So,
so
then if it's like commanding devices is the top of the territory, and then the next step of the territory is like commanding devices and getting them to respond appropriately and accurately. And then you sort of start building a niche from there of like, and why can't we do that yet? What's getting in the way? What are the sort of mechanisms or the lags in technology that are keeping us from doing that? Then sort of digging in from there, like what will we need in order to address those lags in technology or solve that particular problem? And then you can go and fill. So everyone treat your explain like I'm 5 as the top of the territory, and then gradually ask through kind of critical questions like, why can't we already do this? Why is this not already solved? Why don't we already know this? And then like just keep digging in on that for each layer, and literally like treat it like layers that you're sort of going like sedimentary rock, like one layer at a time, and you'll find your way to like make your research that. So the knowledge problem, I want to say that explain like I'm 5 isn't the knowledge problem. It's the territory. In fact, it's the very tippy top of the territory layer. Does that make sense, Alicia?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Well, I actually am giving another workshop at 1 o'clock. So if you want to come to that, it's on cover letters for the academic job market. And it's on the website, the Writing Hub website. But otherwise, I need to skedaddle, and it's been really good to talk with y'all. And I hope you found this information helpful and useful for you as you move forward.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everybody. Happy Friday.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.